Not every system shapes the world. Some shape how the world is seen. Before you ever form an opinion, before you choose a side, before you decide what is right, wrong, fair, or outrageous, someone has already decided which story reaches you first. For over half a century, one family learned how to live in that space between event and interpretation, not by writing history, by framing what history looks like on a screen. This is Box, the Bloodlines of Power, and this time we are not looking at a government, a throne, or an oil empire. We are looking at the dynasty that learned to turn attention into a kind of reality. Before we continue, a brief clarification. This documentary does not endorse, oppose, or promote any political, ideological, or institutional viewpoint. Everything you are about to hear is based entirely on publicly available information, historical records, archived reporting, academic research, and documented media history. What follows is an interpretation, not an accusation, and not a conclusion. You are not asked to agree with it. You are not asked to accept it. You are encouraged to verify the information independently and verify twice. The purpose of this analysis is to explore how influence can shape perception and how perception can shape what we believe is real. Interpretation remains yours. Now, let's continue. Before a story becomes history, before it becomes memory, it begins as something far simpler. A moment that someone chooses to show you. For most of you in existence, attention was a personal act. You looked where you wanted to look. You listened to what was near. Reality was limited by distance. But in the 20th century, something changed. Screens replaced distance, and attention stopped belonging to the person who used it. It became something that could be directed, concentrated, monetized, and eventually controlled. Not by force, but by deciding which images arrive first and which ones arrive louder. Long before the Murdoch family built an empire, this transformation had already begun. They didn't invent attention, they learned how to shape it. Not through secrecy and not through power in the traditional sense, but by understanding one simple truth. People don't react to events. They react to the version of events that reaches them, and whoever controls that version holds a kind of influence that does not look like power at all. Every empire begins with something small, a plot of land, a factory, a single idea. This one began with a modest afternoon newspaper in Adelaide, Australia. When a young Rupert Murdoch inherited it, it wasn't a powerhouse. It wasn't influential. It wasn't even particularly profitable. It was just a paper, the kind most people read without remembering a single headline the next day. But Murdoch understood something that many publishers of the time didn't. A small paper can matter if it knows what people will look at first. Not the most important story, not the most complex, not the most accurate. The story that pulls the eye. So he learned to think not like a journalist, but like an architect of attention. He experimented with placement, with emotional cues, with the rhythm of headlines. He learned that the front page is not a window into the world. It's a frame deciding what the world looks like before anyone has the chance to question it. And once you learn how to guide someone's attention, you are no longer just reporting events. You are shaping the version of events they will remember. A single paper can shape a street, a city, maybe a region. But influence on that scale still depends on geography. Murdoch wanted something larger, a network that ignored borders. In the 1960s and 70s, as broadcasting expanded and printing technology accelerated, he began acquiring newspapers one by one. Not the biggest, not the most prestigious, the ones positioned like entry points into public attention, local tabloids, evening papers, morning editions, each small on its own, but powerful together because they created a continuum of visibility. Morning, midday, evening, night, a cycle of information that never fully stopped. And as more papers joined the network, something subtle began to happen. They stopped functioning as individual voices. They began functioning as a system, with synchronized timing, shared rhythms, and a similar understanding of what deserved to be amplified. Not control, not censorship, coordination, a structure forming quietly around the flow of public attention, because once you control the rhythm of what people see, you don't need to control their beliefs. Beliefs tend to follow whatever the rhythm repeats. Information doesn't spread because it's important. It spreads because it feels important. Long before the digital era, Murdoch understood something that most publishers treated as a footnote. People don't follow facts. They follow sensations. Not necessarily the dramatic kind. Sometimes a headline that triggers curiosity moves faster than a headline that explains. Sometimes a story that evokes fear stays longer in memory than a story that delivers clarity. And sometimes the simplest image can override the most detailed argument. This wasn't manipulation, it was observation. If a newspaper chooses one emotionally charged headline out of 20 neutral ones, that headline sets the tone for how the entire day feels, not because it's the only truth, but because it's the first truth that reaches you. Murdoch learned to work inside that space, the thin layer between event and emotion, where stories are not just told, they are felt. And once a story is felt, it becomes harder to question, harder to replace, and easier to repeat. Not every system of influence needs complexity. Some need only the right sensation at the right moment. Influence is not always about scale. Sometimes it's about timing. And Murdoch learned early that attention can be shaped not by what you publish, but when, how, and in what rhythm you deliver it. 3 elements formed the spine of what would later be recognized as the Murdoch style, though he never called it that. First, stories moved fast, not to outrun the competition, but to catch the moment before it hardened into opinion. Speed wasn't aggression, it was strategy. Second, each story carried a clear emotional signal: curiosity, shock, amusement, fear, not overwhelming, but unmistakable. A rhythm of sensation woven into the flow of daily life. Third, the repetition, not of facts, but of tone. Day after day, paper after paper, headline after headline, the network developed a recognizable cadence, a feeling, something you could sense even before reading the words. And once a media ecosystem acquires a stable rhythm, it stops behaving like a group of newspapers. It begins behaving like a single organism with one heartbeat. Not controlled, not commanded, aligned. This alignment, this consistent rhythm of attention, was stronger than any single headline. It created an environment where stories didn't just inform people, they guided what people expected to see next. Every dynasty begins as a family, but once it grows large enough, once it begins operating across borders, industries, and decades, something shifts. It stops behaving like a group of individuals and starts behaving like an institution. The Murdochs reached that threshold quietly. Rupert was no longer just a publisher. He became the center point of a widening network that required not just leadership, but continuity. That continuity arrived in the form of his children, not as heirs to wealth, but as heirs to a system that needed a next phase to remain stable. Lachlan, James, Elizabeth, each with different instincts, different visions, different ideas of what influence should look like, But personal differences matter less when the structure is larger than any person inside it. A media empire does not wait for consensus. It moves, it expands, it reinforces its own survival. And as the Murdoch children stepped into roles once occupied only by their father, a new reality emerged. This was no longer a family running a business. This was a business shaping a family. And like any large institution, it began placing demands on loyalty, on vision, on identity, until the line between inheritance and obligation blurred. At this scale, blood becomes less relevant. What matters is who can maintain the rhythm of the system. Before we continue, a brief note. If you find value in uncovering how influence really works, consider subscribing. It helps this archive reach the people who are still looking for answers in the dark. And if you see the world with a different angle than the one presented here, share your interpretation in the comments. Perspective is part of the record. And for a very different kind of truth, the satirical one, you'll find the link to my other channel, Punchline Protocol, in the description. Now, let's go deeper. Most families pass down land, businesses, or names. The Murdochs pass down something far more diffuse and far more persistent: the ability to define what the world pays attention to, not by dictating opinions, but by shaping the landscape of stories that people encounter every day. For the next generation, inheritance was not measured in dollars or corporate titles. It was measured in access to the levers that decide which narratives rise and which ones dissolve before reaching the surface. Attention became the family language. Understanding how a story will feel before it is even told became the unspoken skill passed from one era to the next. And with every newsroom acquired, every broadcast channel integrated, every platform added to the network, the inheritance grew. Not in size, in reach, because influence doesn't rely on controlling what people think. It relies on guiding what they think about. That was the true legacy, a system where the flow of perception moved through channels the family had built, refined, and ultimately normalized. And once perception becomes an inheritance, it stops belonging to any one generation. It becomes part of the environment itself. Every form of influence carries a cost, not the kind recorded in ledgers or noted in public statements, but the quiet kind, the kind that appears only when you step back far enough to see the whole structure at once. As the Murdoch network expanded, its stories began shaping not just what people believed, but what people expected to believe. Expectations become patterns, patterns become habits, and habits eventually become the lens through which the world is interpreted. None of this required intention. Influence on this scale is rarely the result of a single choice. It is the accumulation of countless small decisions. Which headline is placed at the top? Which detail is emphasized? Which moment is allowed to define the tone of the day? None of these actions seem significant on their own, but multiplied across decades, across cities, across continents, they begin to create a kind of atmospheric pressure, a subtle push towards certain interpretations and away from others. Influence the quiet is easy to overlook, until you realize that the stories shaping your understanding are not simply appearing. They are arriving through a system designed long before you ever saw it. And once a system becomes the environment through which perception flows, the cost is not paid by those who built it. The cost is paid by those who live inside it without ever noticing the walls. Every large system eventually reveals the strain of its own weight, not through dramatic collapse, not through a single catastrophic moment, but through fractures, small, specific, and impossible to ignore. For the Murdoch Empire, one of those fractures became visible in 2011, when the long-running British tabloid News of the World abruptly shut down. The headlines focused on the scandal, but the deeper story was structural, a system built on speed, sensation, and constant visibility had reached a point where the pressure to deliver outpaced the ability to monitor every decision. Not an agenda, not a conspiracy, a mechanical overload. When a network grows fast enough, its individual parts begin making choices the center cannot fully oversee. And those choices, replicated across desks, time zones, and deadlines, can create situations where the ambition of the system exceeds the caution of the people inside it. The closure of News of the World was not just the end of a newspaper. It was the moment the empire realized that even the strongest structure can be undermined by the momentum it helped create. A reminder that influence, once automated, does not always follow the intentions of its architects. Sometimes it simply follows its own inertia. At a certain scale, influence stops behaving like something a person directs. It becomes something the system produces on its own. Once the Murdoch network reached enough outlets, enough cycles, enough synchronized workflows, the pattern of influence no longer depended on any single decision. Stories moved because the structure was designed to move them. Emotional cues spread because the rhythm rewarded speed. Narrative tones repeated because repetition had become the system's default language. This wasn't intention, it was automation. A momentum built over decades, reinforced by the habits of thousands of employees, thousands of deadlines, and millions of expectations from an audience trained to anticipate a certain kind of story. At this point, the family's role shifted. They were no longer pushing the machine. They were maintaining it. Influence without an author is one of the rarest forms of power. It doesn't require a mastermind, a motive, or even direct control. It requires only a system that knows how to continue on its own. And once perception begins operating automatically, the question is no longer who controls it, but who does it control when no one is watching. When a dynasty reaches its second or third generation, the nature of inheritance changes. The first generation builds, the next one maintains what has been built, and the generation after that often discovers that the weight of the structure is greater than any individual inside it. For the Murdochs, succession was never just a matter of names or titles. It was a transfer of momentum, a living ecosystem of media outlets, workflows, expectations, and an audience trained to look to their platforms for the rhythm of the day. Lachlan, James, Elizabeth, each stepped into roles that had been shaped long before they ever touched them. Some embraced expansion, some questioned direction, some stepped sideways into different parts of the media world. But personal preference matters less when the system itself continues to move. A network that spans continents does not wait for perfect alignment. It adapts. It absorbs. It survives. The next generation became caretakers of a structure that no longer needed a single guiding hand. Power at this level has no face. It has continuity. And continuity does not ask who deserves influence. It asks only who is willing to hold the system steady as it continues to run. Influence without a name is still influence, sometimes the most enduring kind of all. At some point, media stopped being a channel. It became an environment, not something you read or watch or listen to, something you live inside. The Murdoch network, like many large media ecosystems, didn't just report on the world. It helped define the atmospheric conditions through which people moved each day. What felt urgent? What felt distant? What felt dangerous? What felt normal? Influence on this scale is not loud. It's ambient. You don't notice a climate by looking at it. You notice it when it changes, when the temperature shifts, when the pressure rises, when the wind moves in a direction you weren't expecting. A media environment works the same way. It sets the emotional weather of a society: calm, anxious, hopeful, uncertain. And once the rhythm of an entire network becomes familiar, people begin responding not to individual stories, but to the climate those stories create. Not every dynasty shapes laws or borders or governments. Some shape something quieter, something that runs underneath every conversation, every headline, every unspoken assumption about what the world feels like today. And when media becomes the environment, power becomes the air, invisible, constant, and taken for granted by everyone who breathes it. Every system eventually reaches a point where it no longer needs the people who built it. The names fade, the faces disappear, but the structures, the networks, the habits, the rhythms continue. Not out of loyalty, out of momentum. The Murdoch empire, like any large media ecosystem, became something that could run even when its architects stepped away. Newspapers kept printing, channels kept broadcasting, websites kept updating. The flow of stories moved forward not because someone pushed it, but because it had been moving for so long that stopping was no longer part of its design. Influence, once established, has a way of surviving without an author. It travels through institutions, through expectations, through the daily habits of millions of people who never notice the origin of the rhythm they're following. And when a system outlives its creators, what remains is not intention, but structure. A structure shaped by decades of decisions, patterns, and unseen choices that continue to echo long after the voices behind them have gone quiet. Influence does not vanish. It lingers in the architecture. Influence is easiest to see when you look at the people who built it. But the real story begins when you look at the world after they're gone, when the names have faded, when the hands that shape the system have stepped away. And yet the rhythm remains, the structures remain, the expectations remain. You are left not with a dynasty, but with an environment that continues to shape what feels important, what feels distant, what feels true. Not because someone is guiding it, but because it has been guiding itself for a very long time. So here is the only question that matters now. If perception can be shaped without anyone standing behind it, then where does your own vision truly begin? This is Box. Next story drops Wednesday.